Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always a treat to talk to Charles Todd, whom, as you can plainly tell, is not Charles Todd, but rather Caroline and Charles Todd. And we're going to talk about their new book, An Irish Hostage. And Caroline has the only copy that any one of us can hold up. So let us see it, Caroline. There it is. Okay, gorgeous. So I actually have had, excuse me, the treat of reading a corrected manuscript that Charles sent to me. And I have to say, it was a really fabulous experience. I love seeing how your minds worked, where stuff is crossed out and stuff is added. I mean, it was distracting.
Oh my goodness, you got that version.
I did. And you know, it really added a whole layer, which nobody else will get to share, a whole layer of enjoyment to it. And I wanted to tell you both that I liked all your changes. If I were in editor mode, you know, I would have said, good, you know, good, the whole bit. So which one of you tends to make more revisions?
I think it's sort of.
Those were the copy edits. Those are where we get the copy editor puts in questions and then we answer them and make the modifications. It's not so much all of our back and forth questions and answers we've done before it actually gets sent to HarperCollins.
Yeah, but some of them were purely stylistic, Charles. You know, yeah. I mean, a better word choice, or, you know, you remove something superfluous or added something. And, you know, I can see, I brought this up to say, I see how hard they both work to make their books the best they possibly can be. Because it really is a lot of work to go through those kinds of tweaks and revisions. Killing all your darlings. Well, you didn't kill them all, but some.
Well, this is the last chance you have before the galleys to make any corrections, to see a point that you might have missed, to make something a little smoother. Right. It's more a polishing than anything else. And it's fun to do because you all of a sudden see something, you think, oh, that's even better.
Right. No, I should have made it clear. This was polishing. It wasn't like you were, you know, ripping out scenes or doing anything dramatic. It was great. Anyway, a toast to you both. It's such a pleasure to see you. And absolutely. I like to think that our events are BYOB. So
yeah, right.
Absolutely.
So this book is part of the story of Bess Crawford and World War II, but it's a part that we don't all know nearly as well as we know what happens on the continent. So basically this is Ireland and Ireland's role and not role in the war. And you know, guys, you made me think of Erskine Childers. Patrick, you'll be so proud of me that I remembered his name, because usually I have to ask Patrick to use the chat thing to tell me who he is. But he wrote what many people think is the very first spy story. And he was Irish. And although the spy story is set in the Frisian part of the North Sea, and it's an early look at Germany and Great Britain, I think in maybe 1905, something like that. But yeah, anyway, so. You know, naval espionage and all that good stuff. But it's a great story. And then Childers was actually executed by the British for treason in 1919, which is why he never wrote another book. And I've always sort of wondered what happened. You know, I mean, he wrote this story. He was clearly on the British side, you know, and then they executed him. So your book, in a way, tells us what happened to Erskine Childers, as well as what's happening to the people in the book. So why did you decide to go to Ireland with this one? I mean, was this sort of a good time for Bess, having the war's over and she's trying to figure out her role? Is she going to stay as a nursing sister? You know, what's she going to do?
Well, with the seeds of this story actually begin in A Duty to the Dead, the first Bess Crawford book. There was an Irish nurse on board Britannic when it hit a mine or whatever history decided brought it down, sank it. And there was an Irish nurse on board. Bess managed to get her into a lifeboat. And even though they had very little to work with on an island not too far away, she managed, with the doctor's help, to save Eileen's legs. They were badly lacerated. She had come too close to one of the propellers. So Eileen was sent back home to recover and recuperate and sort of faded out of the story for a while. But when we were looking at the fact that we hadn't talked about the Irish Troubles, we could see that we could go back to Eileen and follow what had happened to her back in Ireland. She had recovered, she had learned to walk. The end of the war came and her fiance was on his way back to Ireland. He was Irish and he had fought for the British in France. And she wants Bess there. She wants Bess to stand up with her, to see that she can walk down the aisle under her own power. But the problem is that Eileen knows that she's going to have a very wedding in the church at home, but it's going to have to leave Ireland because she served the British and her fiance served in the Irish Guards that Victoria had established towards the end of her reign. These men had gone to war for England, thinking that if they fought for England's cause, England would turn around and give them home rule as a response to their courage and their willingness to die. But that was in 1914. And then in 1916, the Irish decided that nothing was going to work and they were going to rebel. And that was the rising of Easter 1916. And it turned everything upside down. People who weren't really happy with the idea of a rising took one look at what the British were doing to the ringleaders, executing them, and suddenly began to support the cause. And this left the poor Irish soldiers who were coming home from France in 1919 high and dry. They were considered traitors to their own country. And this gave you a sense of how the Irish problem twisted in on itself. So when Bess is asked to come and walk down the aisle, her parents say, no, it's too dangerous. But then she finds a way. Unfortunately, by the time she gets there, everything has changed so dramatically that she's caught in the middle.
Well, we can talk about how she got there, which is really fun. But Charles, remind me, did Ireland itself, not the Orange State, but the other part of Ireland, did it stay neutral in World War I?
Well, Northern Ireland still is part of England, but Ireland itself did not, it was still run by the British. And it was the Easter Rising in Dublin when they were trying to have self-rule in Ireland, not Northern Ireland. And it gave us an opportunity, we had Bess during the war and then helping the victims of the war and those kinds of things. This is another chapter of a situation that came out of World War I that had not been resolved. And the British, although they had made some overtures about self-rule, a limited self-rule for Ireland, after the Troubles, they just yanked it all. And there are quite a few stories of soldiers coming home, burning their uniforms, hiding their uniforms, even telling stories like they'd been in prison during the war and that kind of thing, so that people weren't treating them like traitors because they felt that all these people who went off and fought for England didn't give a moment's thought to Ireland and had deserted them in their time of need.
So it was one country, not two, as it currently is, divided. But
Right.
Was serving in the war always voluntary for Britain and Ireland, or was there conscription involved? Because it
There
appears
was
to be that
conscription.
So they volunteered.
They
They
primarily
were thinking
volunteered.
that-
Later in the war, they had conscription, and The only country that didn't have conscription during World War I was New Zealand, and yet they, on a per capita basis, they contributed more in terms of troops than any other of the British colonies. But there were a lot. In 1914, it was still all volunteer, and Caroline's exactly right. They volunteered thinking, all right, if we show that we're team players, so to speak,
Right.
then when the war is over, England will look favorably upon our sacrifice and give us an opportunity at home rule.
So the fact that they volunteered is what allowed many of the Irish to view those people who volunteered as traitors. Whereas if they'd been conscripted, it would have been like there wasn't any choice involved.
Right.
I think
One
it's
very interesting little tidbit, the Irish Guards that I mentioned earlier, that Victoria had established as part of the household guards, was the unit that Rudyard Kipling's son fought in, even though he was not Irish. And he died rather tragically. Kipling never got over that.
right. No, I know that. I've been to
Probably
visit
use the
Kipling.
Irish Guards.
Yeah, I've been to visit Kipling's home, and you're right. He never did get over it any more than Conan Doyle ever got. I mean, it was tragic for people losing their children. They didn't really recover. So in order for Bess to go to Ireland, I know there's a story here that I want to elicit from you. She flies with an American
Yes.
pilot, and she flies from Bristol, which is on the Irish Sea over there below the River Severn, and flies across Ireland to the West Coast to a village that I'm presuming you made up, although maybe not. But it's really wonderful because people aren't used to flying. So you have some
Yes.
lovely paragraphs where Beth is like blown away by having a bird's eye view of Wales as she's passing over it and so forth. But somewhere in some literature that you sent me, there's a hint that one of you or both of you have actually flown in one of those early
Oh,
planes.
yes.
Is that
We
right?
were attending Magna Cum Laude in Indianapolis, and Catherine Kennison's husband's ex-Air Force. And they knew a man that had a 1919 Great Lakes, 1920 Great Lakes biplane. And actually, he couldn't take us up to ride because according to the FAA, he would be an airline, but he could give us an introductory flying lesson. And so on a cold November day in Muncie, Indiana, we took turns. Caroline went up, I went up, and Deanna went up. And it was quite an experience. It was cold, it was gray, it was rainy, and no room in the plane for you to wear a parachute. So you're just sitting there and hoping for the best, looking at a dashboard that had less gauges on it than you have in your car.
Well, it certainly wasn't computerized like it is in your car, but
Not at all.
it's sort of hard to imagine today, the thrill of going up in a plane and having a bird's eye view of the landscape. And I bring that up because we did a really interesting program with Sir Roderick Flood of Oxford a little while back called England's Magnificent Gardens. And he's an economic historian, so he was really talking about the financial engine that the gardens can be in England. But he at one point had drawings of an 18th century estate, which had been laid out with a bird's eye view, but he pointed out that nobody had ever had one. So that the garden designer somehow or other was able to envision in his mind and in his presentation how it would look if you were up in a plane or a drone or whatever, looking down on what he had designed in the garden. And, it really shocked me because I thought how true that until flight, none of us ever had a bird's eye view.
It's very different from flying a commercial airplane where you're up so high, what's down on the ground is just a blur. When you're up between 1,000 and 3,000 feet doing 80 miles an hour, and there's nothing between, you're looking over the side of the plane, there's nothing down there between you and the ground. you see it in a whole different way than than we see it when we fly commercially.
Oh,
And
yeah.
the main thing is you had the stick between your legs. So whatever the pilot did, you could feel with your feet on the rudders and your hands on the stick. And he was very good. He would say, now let's slide slip towards the lake to see if there are any boats out there. Or see those, I think they were some sort of granaries. He said, see those, think of those as artillery. Over here, think of this as where the trench line is. And you are thinking in terms of what the other guy is getting ready to do as you watch him come forward, and you can signal the people on the ground. I mean, he was a marvelous, marvelous person to fly with. And you really got the feeling of what it must be like to have been the original pilots who did just this. Their first job was to find out what the enemy was about to do. And then later on, they learned to drop bombs and have dogfights. But the first duty was to find out where the enemy was and where he was going to be moving next. It was reconnaissance.
Well, it was truly hands-on. I mean, you make that very clear in your description. So Jackson, the American, whom Bess says is more in love with flying than he's ever going to be with her or anybody else, and I can see that. They make their flight, and there's a little field at this village, and it's not an ideal landing place. It's a small field. There's stone wall, probably, rocks or whatever all over. And so coming into land is exciting, but it's such a small plane that it's not necessary that anybody notices it. I mean, it's not like jet engines and lights and runways.
Yeah.
That's right.
Float in.
And they were all too busy at the police station.
Yeah, so it's interesting the way he flies in and then he flies out to do things. And, I love the way the airplane was, because you've got to cross the sea. So you can't be thinking about, trains and other stuff, although boats come into play. But I love the way that this little plane is a bridge back to.
Where that little plane came from? In where we introduced the character? From New Mexico. There was a pilot in New Mexico who was very much interested in joining the Lafayette Escadrille. And we got to see some of his, the aircraft he used and what his interest in flying was. So we translated him into one of our characters in A Cruel Deception. Liked him so much, he came back to fly Bess in this book.
Yes, well, I mean, one hoped for a moment he might be a potential romantic interest, but you've been channeling Bess towards a romantic interest for quite a while. So at some point, I'm not saying anymore, at some point she's going to have to make some decisions about what she's going to do post-war and who she might chance to do it with. And in fact, she's a little startled in this book when she realizes that Eileen and her fiance are so in love, and there's such a powerful emotion there, and she's a bit introspective and recognizes that hasn't yet happened to her. At least she doesn't think it has. She's been so devoted to duty and living up to the Colonel Sahib, living up to his standards and all that. She's really never allowed herself that kind of personal attachment. So
the main thing was I'm sorry, go ahead, Charles.
It was strongly pushed in Queen Alexandria's that for the reputation and professionalism of the organization, if Bess had shown any interest or inclination in that vein, she would not have remained in Queen Alexandria's. That's not to say that some of the other nurses, some of the Red Cross people, those kinds of things, it was a little different, but there was an esprit de corps with Queen Alexandria's that was, you just accepted the fact, you didn't think about it.
So you're saying that basically Queen Alexandria's nurses couldn't be married, or could
No,
they?
not at all.
No, so they were single
No.
women.
They wanted to make sure that the Queen Alexandras were above reproach. They were officers in the British Army as well as nurses, and they didn't want them hunting in the battlefield, so to speak. But this was true of many of the organizations because a lot of these young women were not married. And the idea of a young woman who had never seen a man in his underwear suddenly having to bathe him on the battlefield so they could find out where to stitch the wound, there had to be a sense of propriety. And one of her flatmates, I don't know if you remember, Diana fell in love very early on and made it through to the end before she got married, but she was married before Eileen, as soon as she could get out of the nursing corps and her husband was free, they got married and Bess went to her wedding.
No, I fully understand the respectability thing, but in a way, you'd think that married women or widows would in fact have been a better choice in the sense that it wouldn't have been such a shock to them to see naked men.
Well,
But
some
they,
of it is the fact
they
that widows
also
were not
wanted
necessarily.
younger women who were not attached and did not have families and things to leave behind. If they were going to get involved in supporting the war effort, they were pointed in other directions rather than nursing.
Gotcha. I just thought it was an interesting idea. I thought about that when I was reading your comments about, how Bess couldn't have a relationship and stay in the nursing sisters, that, it was interesting that they took single women and then the single women had to live up to that kind of a standard because if they were gently sheltered, a lot of it was going to be a huge shock when they served. Probably less for Beth because after all, she grew up in an Army family. And so she would have had more contact, with soldiers and men.
That was integral. And when we decided to create the character of Bess, we felt it was very important that she had that experience from India so that we didn't want a central character fainting at the sight of blood and suddenly shocked by this or that, or having no concept of how the military worked or who outranked whom, these kinds of things. So she had a skill set that she brought into the war with her that was easily explained by her experiences in India and being a part of a military family, so that she could assimilate very quickly into the organization.
Right.
One of my favorite, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Favorite lines is in the preceding book where Bess is trying to stop a killer and someone says to her, well, you were just lucky to get those shots off. And Bess says to herself, luck had nothing to do with it because she had been taught to use weapons and she was able to do what she had to do without making it obvious that she was a trained shot.
Well, your novella from last December, I thought did a wonderful job in showing us a very young Bess in India and pointing all this out. But, since Rutledge is post-war, we meet Rutledge when the war is over and he's suffering the repercussions of his service there. Did you create Bess in order to take us through the war? Because you couldn't really do it with Rutledge, although there's a prequel in there somewhere where you do show us some of it.
A Forgotten Place.
Right.
Primarily, the thing was, as you're doing your research, you come across little tidbits and things that you hope to have a home for. And we kept coming across with things more related to the women's perspective of the war, especially after we did Murderstone, which was Francesca Hatton's experience and the results of the war. And so we had suddenly realized that we'd gathered a lot of information on that perspective on the war and felt that it was something that needed to be done. And at the same time, we had, by that time, I think we'd done 10 Rutledge mysteries and felt confident that we could continue to devote the quality and time and effort into the Rutledge books, not to leave him left behind in the dust, so to speak, and take on another series. And Caroline will tell you what happened when we told our editor about it.
We wanted to show what women had done for the war effort. I mean, it bought them the vote at the end of the war. And so we mentioned in May, well, late April, when we were there for
Edgar's
banquet, we mentioned to our editor that we were thinking about doing a second series with Bess in the war to show that part of it from the woman's perspective. And I wasn't sure how she was going to take it, but Carolyn Marino listened to what we said and she said, "Can you have it by September?" Not really, but she really liked the concept of seeing Bess's war and Rutledge's aftermath, two very different views of what was happening to women and to the soldiers in the trenches.
Well, that's very true. But now you've brought Bess forward. The war is over, and she's, nudging up into Rutledge territory in the sense of what comes afterward. So that was always going to be true, right? Is unless you were going to just drag it out during the war, you were always going to progress towards 1918. And then what happens? I keep wondering when I was reading this book, could I hear the footprints of the flu? Could I hear, the great flu kind of echoing off there on the side?
Well, we'd already done the influenza epidemic.
I know, but can you avoid it with Bess if you've already written it for Rutledge?
No, we wrote it in a Bess book.
Not too late for that?
That was the one where
The unmarked
Bess-
grave.
what?
The unmarked grave.
Yeah, that's the one where Bess
Right.
taking a body to the temporary morgue, and the sheet falls off someone whose corpse is in the next level up. And as the sheet falls off, she sees that this man did not die of the flu. There's no discoloration.
Right.
And
No, I
so that
remember
was how
that,
she
but
did it.
The flu went on for a long time. So what year are we in this, in an Irish hostage? Where are we?
Close to June of 1919.
Yeah.
This is the period where Rutledge has just left the clinic as they're going into Scotland Yard. And Bess is mentions in this book somewhere that everybody is concerned about his health, that he's out of the clinic, and they hope he will do well. They don't need or anything, but that's the time Bess is at the wedding.
To answer your question, Barbara, I think that the big difference is Bess is an amateur sleuth, Rutledge is a police procedural.
Right.
And Bess and the type of person that she is and her interests have the ability to go past the war in whatever future form she decides. Right now, starting with A Cruel Deception and continuing on in An Irish Hostage, as you said before, she's realizing that they're reducing the size of the nursing corps. They're getting rid of people left and right. And now that the war is over, she has to make some decisions about what she's going to do with the rest of her life. And we sure like to think that there's more stories to tell about Bess.
Well, I hope so. I mean, it's more than just professional or, what she's going to do in terms of work, but is she going to keep her flat in London, in the lodging house where she's been so happy? Is she going to be able to go up to London? There was a lot more freedom for young unmarried women during the war that were playing these roles. But, you know, is
Yes.
the gate going to close somewhat now that the war is over? And, you know, can an unchaperoned Bess go off to London for weeks at a time? Or is she going to need to live near home? And, you know, it's a lot. I mean, the war is a big dislocator and nothing will be
Yes.
the same. But the question is, how will it not be the same is an important one.
And
And
you're
that's
right
what we'll
around the
address in
corner.
the next book.
For a young woman in her age group, there was a lot of society changes that came out of that war, going from the 1919 into the early 20s. Very different atmosphere, because a lot of the women did not want to reassimilate back into their old roles
Right.
in their Edwardian Victorian type society. Things
A
had
lot of,
changed.
yeah, no, it's true. A lot of women didn't want to go back into service in the big houses and, you know, people got used to having money and, you know, place of their own. It was all quite different. Well, let's talk about some of the Irish characters. The granny is really a dreadful person. So which one of you decided to write the granny, or was that a joint enterprise? Because I mean, she's really awful.
The
It's
which one?
right,
The
Oh,
granny.
the green parrot?
the granny.
The
Oh,
granny,
Granny.
Eileen's
Granny?
grandmother.
Granny, unfortunately, was typical of what was happening in Ireland. Ruth Dudley Edwards was talking to us once about what the war had done to Ireland, how these problems with the Irish troubles had begun. And she had a granny very similar to the granny, or her family did, very similar to the granny we had. We gave her a much more malevolent background, but
Yeah, because Ruth grew up with both grandmothers living in the house with her family.
and it just seemed like such a perfect opportunity to put the two viewpoints about the troubles into the mouths of these two grandparents. One was very forceful, one was not, but in the end, the one who was not had to learn to step up. So it gave us a chance to talk about how the trouble split families, how you never knew whether this one was pro or con. They kept it to themselves, and yet sometimes things would happen and they would go ahead and act on what they felt and cause all sorts of troubles. It just was a very interesting way to see how political situations can destroy families. I can remember grandparents and great grandparents telling us about the American Civil War, how they felt in the South, how my husband's family felt in the North, and it was an eye opener.
Well, it really is. But, you
And
know,
yet Bess is still sort of able to get along with her.
She's not
And,
afraid of her.
no, she's not. But you know, the grandmother really, she's so focused on Terence, who fought in Dublin, and is kind of, that's the golden child, so to speak. And I think I speak for both of us. Sometimes it just as in life, you don't have pure villains and pure good people, and everybody's always got a mix of ingredients that makes up their character. And that's with Granny, it's no different.
well, Eileen's family is obviously a critical part of how you want to portray what's going on in the book. And the person I felt sorry for was Eileen's mother. I mean, Eileen is young, and you know, she's had some experience being away, serving until she was so badly injured and all. But her mother appears to have been largely pulverized, you know, caught between Granny and whatever. And I thought, what a hard role that would be, to be that kind of invisible person in the middle of the family where.
Yeah, and she has to learn that she too has to make decisions, that she can't just float through life ignoring the problems. She also has to stand up, and she does in a very critical time.
Yeah, well, and you want it to happen. I mean, you want her to have a journey of her own among all the other journeys going on in this book. But, I did think, I thought she did a wonderful job with it. And, rooting this whole story in this family makes it so personal. I mean, great events are much easier to understand if you can use a smaller viewpoint, a particular family or set of characters instead of the whole scope of the thing. And you're right, there were so many loyalties and so many moral questions and so many family ties involved in all that. Did you think, Bess is extremely stubborn when she is successfully down in the small field there at the house, and it turns out that nobody's really home but Granny and whatever. Did you feel that, some difficulty making a case for why she stayed in the face of, all reason and everybody trying to get her to just get in the plane and go back to Bristol?
She had committed herself to coming to the wedding, and it was only 3 days ahead. And so she thought, I can certainly stay this long and support Eileen, because it looked like Eileen was not going to be able to have the wedding that she dreamed of.
Right.
And felt that she needed to be there to pick up the pieces. Eileen's mother wasn't capable. Granny was in glee that the wedding was going to be called off possibly. And Bess felt that somebody needed to stay there and take care of things. That's the nurturing part of being a nurse, I think.
Well,
and to be quite honest, Bess, her stubbornness is also her strength, her desire to follow things through to the bitter end, no matter what she comes up with. But yes, she does not give up easily.
No. And then she has to make a decision too about whether to involve her father and her father's influence. And, what's the moral question there? And would that make extra danger and a whole bunch of things? I mean, even during the war, even the fact that her father, was a high-ranking military officer, creates some situations for Bess that a person lacking that kind of family structure wouldn't have. So I thought it was interesting that his influence is still so strong, even though he's not in Ireland at least when we start the book.
But she knows that if he comes to Ireland to rescue her, he'll be in danger, and she won't be in danger for her. I mean, she made the decision, right or wrong, to stay, and now she doesn't want to drag him in. But somebody else comes to her rescue. So
Yes. Well, there's some surprises in here. We don't want to spoil anything and give it away. So I know you love to go and visit the locations that you write about. Is it Killy Bay? Is that how you pronounce the little village here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Have you been there or to a similar place?
We went to a very similar place. I've been to Ireland several times, and I spent some time in this little village in Galway. Actually, I was on a expedition ship, and we spent some time there, went out into the countryside to see what that was like. It was really, really quite charming. The problem was that these people on the west coast of Ireland, out facing the Atlantic, are pretty stubborn. I'll do it my own way, sort of.
Yeah, it's the cross between the Irish and the fishermen in them that, they're a rather independent lot.
Well, very true. I've driven the western side of Ireland, and gone
Uh-huh.
the Wild Atlantic Way, and then I've also done it on a cruise ship a couple of times. So, I know the west coast of Ireland a lot better than I know, although that's not true because I've been to Belfast and up into Northern Ireland quite a lot. And Game of Thrones, because it was filmed in the north of Ireland, encouraged travelers to go up into County Antrim, I think it is, and so
Yeah.
forth. And, you've always had the Giant's Causeway is a major tourist
Oh, yes.
attraction and so forth. And Belfast. So the part I probably know least is the part from Dublin south, going down to Cork and coming
Yeah.
around the southeast part. My last visit, we went to the Sillies, which I think are
Oh, I
absolutely
love the sillies.
Oh, and the gardens at Treviso, which are absolutely a knockout.
Well, wasn't it a matter of justice that we did the Scilly Islands?
Yes, we use the Scilly Isles.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's just a hop from Cornwall. We in fact
Yeah.
had coffee in the castle and ran across a couple who had taken the little commuter flight from Cornwall over to the Sillies, sort of like Bess is doing,
Yep.
simply little tiny plane and the whole bit. But the west of Ireland really is wild. I mean, it's quite different than the East Coast, which is not on the Atlantic, and
That's right. And
the landscape is different. The mountains and stuff are much
Yeah.
more on the west side than they are on the east side. It's terrifying driving. My husband loves driving on the left side of the road with a stick shift car and the stone walls, and you thread your needle through it, but he's fine with that.
so you did the Ring of Kerry.
Oh yeah, done all that, the
Oh,
Dingle
yes.
Peninsula. And I really like Galway. We spent a couple of days in Galway when, in fact, Rob bought, believe it or not, a tweed jacket for a spur of the moment from a tailor in Galway. He saw it and he thought, I have to have this. So he did that. And Galway is I knew it from Ken Brune, obviously, who has written
Oh, yeah.
quite a number of hard-boiled
Quite a storyteller.
he is, very dark, police procedurals. I like Jack Taylor a lot. I loved the first Jack Taylor book. I thought it was extraordinary. And, there was very much, because this was in 2019, very much a feeling among all the Irish we met going all the way around it, that they didn't want Brexit. They didn't want the barriers to free travel and so forth to return. They'd gotten used to in 20 years of peace, to being able to go back and forth and not fear for their lives and all the rest of it. So your book, makes me worried in a way that we're going to go back to that. I don't think anybody's shooting necessarily yet, but those barriers have come back. And,
Yes, they have.
and I think that's such a tragic thing, because Ireland has been, since Elizabeth I is the one who really colonized Ireland, and it hasn't been able to break away up until, and now it's still not fully broken away. Might never be. I don't know. It's one of those insoluble problems like Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, very much so. It was very interesting that a lot of the people I talked to when I was in the pubs and the farms and so on had more to say about the famine than they did about the troubles of 16.
It's still alive, isn't
About
it?
that.
Even though it is,
Yes, it is.
we're coming up on 2 centuries, and yet
Yes.
there's that very dramatic sculpture, and I'm trying to remember what harbor it's at. It's a metalwork sculpture of the mother and the children.
I think is it in Cork? I can't remember
Well, it was one of the
That's
places
right.
where debarkation,
Yes. where the
occurred.
ships left.
Yeah, and you can see how, terrible. I mean, the number of people who died from it, the British didn't do, if I remember right, they didn't do anything to try to alleviate all that suffering.
They didn't
That's
do
right.
anything. But, we got a lot of them here. It made Boston a very different town.
And Chicago, no, absolutely
Chicago.
true. Right, but I mean, I think
York.
you say somewhere that, that the memory of that contributed to the Easter uprising, that the Irish didn't trust the British and were still angry about the famine and so forth. So the war, as wars often are, were kind of an accelerator for demanding home rule, but a lot of that was still a reaction to the famine.
Yep.
And it left scars, physical scars. I mean, like the old farm crofts that were still standing. It left emotional scars. It was something that I don't think will ever leave Ireland.
No, I don't either. I agree. Well, we can't talk too much more about the book, although there's some wonderful stuff that is there seeding its way for the next book about Bess. So I'm really looking forward to
Absolutely.
that. Let me call Patrick up from his blackout and see if he has comments or questions.
Fortunately, we've worked up the manuscript and everything for the next book. It's with the publisher. They're working on it. So there'll be a Bess for next year as well. So that's good news.
Okay.
And a very different one.
Is it?
Because in this one, it looks like a simple gallbladder operation turns into something that is going to change Bess's life completely.
Wow.
So stay tuned.
I'll say. All right, Patrick, any questions that you want to forward?
Let's see here. Let's see. So Karen asks, she says, I appreciate historical novels such as yours that allow women to have some agency, there's the buzzword, while still remaining true to the period. So thank you. Could you say a bit more about the way women's work in the war affected the suffrage movement afterwards? What was the logic for women under 30 not being allowed to vote until 1928?
Well, the main reason for that was that the suffragettes had made a bargain with the British government. We will help with the war effort. We won't give you a hard time. We won't march and wind up in prison being force-fed. We'll do all of this for you. And afterwards, we want the vote. Well, they got the vote, but only certain women got the vote. It wasn't universal suffrage until later. But it was a start. Women with property of a certain age, a certain standing in the community could vote, but they kept at it until all the women of let's say, the age of consent could vote. And it was a high price to pay in some ways, because these women did all sorts of things that you wouldn't think of women doing, putting the fuse in shelves, in the bottom of shelves, feeding a farm by running tractors, running omnibuses, working in hospitals, working in factories. I mean, the
Royal Mail.
did really tip the scale.
And it was things that it really turned upside down British society, because it was one thing for women of a certain class to peddle wares, do some work, but this was where everybody suddenly, because there was such a drain on the male population, they were filling in different positions that no self-respecting woman would have even considered doing that kind of work in the Victorian period and even in the Edwardian period. It was
And the problem was,
big change.
a lot of the men didn't come home, and women continued to be postmistresses and work in situations that the men had taken over. A lot
Especially
of
on farms.
Yeah. Well,
really
no,
didn't
I
want to
mean,
go
it was
back
a
to
lot.
what they had been doing.
The death rate for the men was so terrible. And there were also, let's not forget, many women who were never going to marry because there simply weren't enough men to go around. And
Right.
if they couldn't marry and generate and have income generated by a husband, then they were going to have to make their own unless they had family money to inherit. So it forced a lot of people into career paths that might not necessarily have chosen them, but there they were, right?
You figure that if you were 25 or 26 when the war ended, you were very much on the shelf, even by modern standards. And these women became governesses. They learned to teach. They found ways to fit in. Miss Marple was one of them. She found a way to fit in that was entirely different from most of her.
Think about Dorothy Sayers, you know, in the typing agency, you know, in the Harriet Vane tetralogy, a word I hardly ever get to use. But you know, that whole group of women that is it Miss Clemson, something like that, you know, operates all women, sending them out on assignments and so forth. And, you know, that was a career path that women could undertake, white collar work as opposed to, let's say, farm labor or something
Even
similar.
working with the newspapers.
Yeah. Patrick, anything else?
Well, here's a simpler question. Any plans to attend BoucherCon in New Orleans?
Oh,
Oh, we're
yeah.
guests of honor for the historical mystery, so we will be there. It won't be a hurricane at the same time.
We will definitely be there. We're looking forward to it. That's the two things. Getting back to places like BoucherCon and being able to travel to England again.
Absolutely. I have really missed seeing everybody, finding out what's happening, visiting. I mean, it's been a drought in more ways than one. And
Yeah.
I'm tally ho.
I know you are a great traveler, Carolyn, you in particular, but you and Charles together, you've always researched your trips on site. I mean, your novels on site, you know,
Yeah.
you've gone to England, and one reason they feel so compelling and so authentic is that you write about them from actual observation. You know, you didn't just go to Google Maps or something and look stuff up. So yeah, I'm sure it's been really hard for you not to be able to do that traveling. I was going to close by mentioning that they were the guests of honor in BoucherCon in New Orleans, and it's the last week in August. I think it starts August 25th, if I remember. So
Yeah.
before
Yes.
Labor Day. Yeah. So
Are you going to be there?
no, I am not. We
Oh,
have,
shame.
well, we have had, I don't know that I could even describe how much has come our way during COVID. And our schedule is so relentless and so heavy that I can't, I mean, we're all hoping to survive it. Patrick has asked me once or twice, you know, if we really want to work this hard for good, is this going to be a new normal, or, you know, is this going to be a passing thing? You know, there are days when I do 3 or 4 events like this in a row, and it's just been
I
wild.
noticed that looking at the schedule of events, even for tonight.
Right. I mean, we're going to move on to Dan Fesperman and Francine Matthews in some interesting discussion of leaping all the way up to 2001. But it's been wonderful. We've really enjoyed it. We realized last night when we did a live event that we're off our game. We'd forgotten I forgot to get pens for the author. We had an air conditioning duct that was rattling and ruined the, you know, the sound for the video. I mean, so we need to get our game back. And see, so we actually have a live event, a big one for William Ken Kruger right before
Oh, good.
BoucherCon. He's going
Well,
to
tell him
kick
we
off.
said hello.
I will. And
Yes,
then we have a
please.
couple right afterwards. So you know, we're going to be focusing on that. And yeah, we're really going to miss it. You've had a once or twice other guests of honor gigs that have kind of gone south in all of this stuff. I think there was one where you were scheduled to be one, and then I don't remember, was it the pandemic or something that took that away?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm glad for you. I think it's wonderful that you're going to get a chance to, you know, enjoy that kind of an honor, which God knows you deserve. I think it's wonderful.
And we're
Thank
really
you.
looking forward to it. When Mike told us to keep it secret, I thought, how in the world is a woman going to keep news like that secret? But we did.
Good for you. Yeah. I think it's grand that you're going to go and get this honor. And who knows, at the last second, I might be able to fly in. I would do it for you if I could figure out how to do it. That's for sure. Patrick, is there anything else?
Well, Cherie or Sherry, I'm not sure, says, I like the dedications you make to your pets in each book.
Yes, kind of a sad part, but
Yeah.
they are all our pets and we love them very much.
I know it. You dedicated this book to 2 cats that I'm sure were
Yes.
great companions and comforts to you during all this. So we
And,
lost
you know,
our,
You
the
lost your
thing
what?
is that these pets have spent a lot of time with us over the years.
right.
They up by the computer. They've tried to sleep on the computer. I lost a mouse to one that I never found. They were there. They were part of what we were creating.
Yeah.
And, you know, you're sitting there trying to think what to do. You reach out and put a hand on a furry little thing that goes and tells you he's right there or she's right there. Some of them are the pets of friends that we have known quite well. Muffin, we knew so well. Muffin was the only cat I have ever seen who was tall enough to put his hands on the kitchen table and sit there and eat with us. We'd put his little things there on his plate and he would eat them right up just like anybody else. He was,
Mountain lion size, for heaven's sake, Carol.
what?
He must have been mountain lion size.
Oh, he
the
was
cat tall
huge,
enough to
but the
put his-
Gentlest
Wow.
giant you ever saw. And, you know, each one has a personality.
They do.
Well, this is a way of saying thank you for what they have given us.
Barbara, were you going to say you lost one of yours?
Well, Patrick has had this sad experience of losing a very beloved dog, and our little dog Odin, after 15 years, we lost him.
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
Yeah, well, you know, if
well,
you're a pet
is-
owner, you have a real responsibility to pay
Yes, you
attention
did.
to their health and not make them suffer. And his liver, for whatever reason, was just completely shot, and it would have been cruel to, you know.
Oh,
to try to
absolutely.
keep him
But you
going.
still, you mourn
Yeah.
his loss, even though.
We really do. I
may
see
have
him out,
been
I still see
time.
him out walking around the rim of the yard. He had a last walk before he went to the vet. And you know,
Oh,
you'll see him out there sniffing his way along. And, you know, and Patrick has been through this with not only your dog, but your mother-in-law's dog, right?
Mother-in-law's dog, yeah, we had a greyhound, which was just the gentlest
Uh-huh.
soul, you know. And these animals, they live long enough to break your heart, don't they?
They do. My
Absolutely.
mother always said, my mother's
worth it.
mantra was that people live too long and dogs don't live long enough.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
words to live by from Mrs. Gibson, was for
Absolutely.
sure. No,
well,
no,
even my
Absolutely.
daughter lost 2 dogs within 3 weeks of each other.
no, it's just hard.
They were
Anyway,
dogs
on
to
a more
be
cheerful
drawn.
note, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and congratulations on publishing yet another of your wonderful books. An Irish Hostage, I can't hold it up, but we have autographed copies coming from Charles Todd. They're just
There it
somewhere
is.
between us and the East Coast. So,
Caroline's holding it up.
right, so grab one while you still can, because they may be in short supply. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you all for joining us. There'll be a podcast available tomorrow, and the video will live forever on YouTube, so you can recommend it to people. And
Thank you, everybody. I wish I was there in person.
Absolutely.
wish you were
It's
too,
great
but
to
maybe
see
with
y'all.
Rutledge, we can bring you back, which would be really
Oh,
exciting.
Absolutely.
We always look forward to that. That's something that we really enjoy doing. So.
Well, thank you. Let's hope that February will actually work out. So anyway, good night, everybody.
Good
Good night.
night.
All right.